I thought you were going to say on my head, but that'd be all right.
It was on the.
A communication person will be so happy with me.
Yes. Yeah, because this is not a room where where it would be particularly easy to get a picture of you while you were testifying.
Right.
Like some of them have wider areas on the sides
Right.
where you can.
Okay, good morning, everyone. The subcommittee will come to order. I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning, and I especially want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Thank you so much. America's small businesses are a catalyst for creating employment opportunities and driving growth in the U.S. economy. The estimated 30 million small firms in the U.S. represent over 99% of all employers and support nearly 56 million jobs. Small businesses are vital to the well-being of many large and small communities in rural, suburban, and urban areas, and that is why we need to be enacting policies that allow small firms to thrive. One way for Congress to support small businesses is through well-conceived and targeted tax policy. In my short time in Congress so far, I've heard that small firms need a simple tax code, one that levels the playing field and creates opportunities to build Main Street, not Wall Street. The tax policies that are enacted in Washington have a direct impact on the people in my district, back in New Jersey. And take, for example, one of the signature pieces of legislation of this administration, the new tax law. That legislation, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, passed in 2017, was an imperfect one. One example being the cap imposed on state and local tax deductions and the lack of parity between small businesses and corporations. Because of this change to the SALT deduction, millions across my home state have gone from receiving refunds to paying more in federal taxes. And while corporations can still take the full deduction for their state and local taxes, small businesses that report income on their individuals' returns cannot. These are issues that need to be addressed right away. But we are not here today to discuss all the aspects of the new tax law, but one provision that has a laudable goal to spur investment, economic activity, and ultimately job growth in undercapitalized communities. Over the last several decades, and particularly after the financial crisis, thriving towns across the country with vibrant main streets have seen their local economies decimated. As part of the new tax law, opportunity zones were created with the intent to give preferential tax treatment for investors in economically distressed communities, with the hope that these investments will lead to increased economic activity throughout the area. At first glance, these new tax incentives appear to do what many other policy proposals and programs have attempted or failed to do: bring much-needed capital, economic development, and jobs to those communities that need it most. Unfortunately, like many tax incentives, there are opportunities for abuse and few guardrails around the program, which could result in lost opportunity and thwarted congressional intentions. The overall structure of the tax incentives centered around opportunity zones leave many questions unanswered. The centerpiece of the tax incentive is continued deferral of capital gains on previous investments and complete elimination of capital gains tax on gains within opportunity zones that are held for more than 10 years. While this sounds like a reasonable trade-off, it begs the question of what sort of investments will be made, by whom, and what will be prioritized to ensure economic growth, prosperity, and job growth in the near and long term. And while investments can be made in virtually any business or asset, reports indicate that most of the money is flowing towards real estate as opposed to small businesses already operating within the opportunity zone. When an investor buys a property, makes some improvement, and sell it to someone else for a higher price while deferring capital gains, investors, fund managers, and real estate developers benefit, but there doesn't seem to be much benefit to the broader community. Further, with no minimum or maximum investment requirement, few restrictions on who may make investments or set up an opportunity fund, and no public reporting requirements, we must determine how best to measure the success of this new tax provision to determine if it meets the intended goal. And like any new program or tax benefit, we must ask whether our agencies have the proper tools and resources in place to combat waste, fraud, and abuse. This last point is of particular importance as recent news reports highlight the growing concern that opportunity zones are new tax incentives that only benefit those with capital that are looking to further defer and delay paying taxes on capital gains. That is why today's hearing within our committee's jurisdiction is so important. We need to shed light on how this new program works and doesn't work, and what additional regulatory clarity is needed to ensure that low and moderate income communities, where many small businesses operate, are getting the critical investments that the new tax law promised. It is in my hope that this hearing will shed light on the possible benefits that opportunity zones have for small businesses, while looking critically at what are outstanding challenges and real concerns that must be addressed. I firmly believe Congress can work together, just like this committee does day in and day out, to find responsible tax incentives and policies that truly help small firms and strengthen our economy for the long term. With that, I want to thank each and every one of the witnesses for joining us, and I look forward to your testimony. I would now like to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Hearn, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, if I may, I would ask for just a moment of silence for our colleague Elijah Cummins and his family, if I could. Please, just for a moment of silence, please. Thank you so much. It's good to be here with you today, and I look forward to hearing your testimonies. You know, as a small business owner myself for the past 34 years, and including 17 years on a bank board and 13 years on the McDonald's National Leadership Council, with serving over 3,500 McDonald's franchisees. 8 years of that, I was the ombudsman, 5 years as the national chairman of the systems economic team, 5 years on the corporate tax policy team, 8 years on the insurance policy team. There's no better advocate for small business in the United States House of Representatives than myself. And so I want to look at every policy that's coming through here to make sure it actually benefits those who are asking for help. By generating 2 out of 3 jobs in business and across America, this economy depends very heavily on small business, not only small business as we know it, but also the incubators for the large businesses of the future. From traditional brick and mortar storefronts to highly specialized manufacturers, small businesses and entrepreneurs and startups are transforming how business is getting done these days. We must continue to work in a bipartisan manner to ensure that all small businesses operate within an environment that is free of overly burdensome regulations and in an environment that allows them to create jobs and expand. That is why it is important that we are going to be discussing another bipartisan idea that has been implemented and making progress across the country, opportunity zones. As a way to jumpstart economically distressed areas of the nation, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act included a provision to authorize Opportunity Zones programs. This program provides stepped-up tax enhancement for individuals that reinvest their capital gains in targeted economic areas. Opportunity Zones represent a unique working relationship between the federal government, state and local municipalities, and the private sector. Although similar to programs of the past, Opportunity Zones have been created with flexibility to ensure utilization. Within my state of Oklahoma, there have been 117 Opportunity Zones designated. Moreover, approximately 380,000 Oklahomans live in these designated boundaries. In my congressional district alone, Oklahoma's 1st congressional district, we have 23 designated zones. In order to direct investments properly, qualified opportunity funds must be created. Although recent headlines have suggested this program will only benefit certain business sector, this hearing will allow members of the subcommittee to explore how small businesses can better interact with these designated zones. We know that small businesses are the nation's job creators, and thus, when jobs are created in communities, neighborhoods are transformed. The 2 rounds of guidance from the Department of Treasury and the IRS have continued to clarify the roles of businesses within this program. The first round of regulations was published in October of 2018, and the second round came out in April of 2019. With the program in its infancy, we need more information on how investments are being shaped and how dollars are flowing to projects. This information will be critical as we assess its effectiveness. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how this program has been implemented and the steps that have been taken to spur economic development. I know this hearing will provide even more clarity for small businesses across the nation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Hearn. The gentleman yields back, and every time we have one of these hearings, I'm always reminded about how grateful we are and lucky to have your expertise as a small business owner and someone who can really help make sure that we focus in on where the rubber hits the road and make sure we can get things done, which is very much the intention of this subcommittee. The ranking member and I both want to make sure that we can move forward just thinking about what's best for the small businesses. And we come into this hearing with an open mind, just really trying to get at the best understandings of what we've seen so far, trying to glean best practices and trying to understand where we might be able to go from there to the benefit of small businesses, whether in Oklahoma, New Jersey, or elsewhere around this country. If other committee members have opening statements prepared, we would ask that they be submitted for the record. I would just like to take a quick minute to explain the timing rules. So each witness will get 5 minutes to testify, and the members get 5 minutes for questioning. You have a little gizmo in front of you, which is our lighting system. The green light will tell you when to begin. The yellow light comes on when you have 1 minute remaining, and the red light will come on when you're out of time. And we ask that you do your best to stay within the time frames to the best of your ability. I just want to quickly introduce our witnesses before we proceed. I'd like to introduce Mr. Brett Theodos. He directs the Community Economic Development Hub at the Urban Institute, where he is a senior fellow in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center. His work focuses on economic and community development, neighborhood change, affordable home ownership, consumer finance, and program evaluation and learning. Thank you for coming. Our second witness is Mr. Aaron Siebert, the Managing Director of the Social Investment Practice at the Kresge Foundation. Prior to joining the foundation in 2016, Mr. Siebert served as Executive Director at J.P. Morgan Chase Bank, where he was involved with community development banking, focused on new market tax credits and historic tax credit investing. Welcome, Mr. Siebert. Our third witness today is Ms. Jennifer Vasiloff, joined Opportunity Finance Network, OFN, in 2017 as Chief External Affairs Officer, a role capitalizing on her 16 years of experience in promoting and strengthening the CDFI field. Ms. Vasiloff leads the organization's efforts to raise the profile of CDFIs, particularly at the national level. Welcome, Ms. Vasiloff. I'd like to now yield to our ranking member, Mr. Hearn, to introduce our final witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our witness is John Lettieri. Mr. Lettieri is President and CEO and co-founder of the Economic Innovation Group, also known as EIG. EIG is a leader on economic policy matters and an innovator of policy solutions that powers America forward. Mr. Lettieri has previously served as a staffer in the United States Senate and as a Vice President of Public Policy and Government Affairs for the Organization of International Investment, with a focus on economic development. Mr. Lettieri has also testified in the past on Capitol Hill on the topics of opportunity zones. Mr. Lettieri, we appreciate you taking your time away from your company to talk with us today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so very much. And again, grateful to have all four of you here today. Why don't we just jump right in? Mr. Theodos, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Kim, Ranking Member Hearn, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I study private and mission and public financing to understand which communities are accessing capital, which are being left behind, and how to help. The views I offer are my own, not to be attributed to the Urban Institute, its trustees, or funders. It is a legitimate work of the federal government to help communities inadequately connected with capital markets achieve economic growth. We have many examples of federal programs and incentives working to achieve those ends. However, we also have 1031 exchanges and the mortgage interest deduction and EB-5 visas that are poorly targeted to need. Community development policy in the United States 2 or more generations ago consistently relied on federal spending and control. But we've gradually and consistently moved towards a model where the federal government exerts less and less control over federal resources. I submit that opportunity zones mark the near complete transition to privatized federal community economic development policy. A heavy reliance on the private sector to accomplish the public agenda introduces a set of pitfalls. While some zones should never have been chosen or eligible, many do show real need for investment, and OZs will undoubtedly attract substantial capital into zones in aggregate. OZs have four compelling features as I see them. They tap into a new investor pool. They can be used as a tool for mission-driven projects. They encourage a longer-term investment horizon, and they incentivize equity capital, which receives less federal attention. However, as currently structured, OZs have several shortcomings. Their place-based targeting is overly broad, with too many upper-income communities included. For example, zones in Manhattan and Brooklyn and Berkeley where the median home is worth more than $1 million. Real estate will be the largest use case, and there are already better targeted federal supports for real estate. There are not sufficient project type or use requirements in contrast with other federal tools. So for example, no requirements that new apartments be rented at affordable prices. There's no requirement for community input or engagement under this new incentive. Many OZ investors report they would have done the deal in the exact same form absent the incentive, meaning the federal government is subsidizing projects that don't actually need the help. And finally, there's a lack of reporting requirements. Congress should consider the following reforms. First, tighten the number of eligible zones by removing all contiguous tracts, as well as those that, as they gain investment, stop qualifying as low-income communities. Second, Congress should more narrowly restrict qualifying investments. For instance, only real estate transactions where the operating business is the owner-occupant, or where housing is sold or rented at below-market prices. Third, any investment into a CDFI, a community development financial institution, any investment controlled into a vehicle that they control should be given preferential treatment. Fourth, Congress should add a but-for or a substitution test to restrict the incentive to projects that could only proceed with the additional help. Fifth, Congress should consider restructuring the tax benefits by extending the temporary deferral, by converting the step-up in basis to a sliding scale that depends on the level of economic distress in the zone, and by eliminating the permanent exclusion. Finally, Congress should require transaction-level reporting for all OZ investments on who, what, where, when, and how much. So who the investors and the investees are, what the investment was for, when the investment was made, where the investment went, and how much was invested. It's important to note that Treasury could improve this incentive even now, but if Treasury fails to take these steps, Congress should act. Treasury could make this more like a program, not merely an incentive, by giving responsibility to a sub-agency with dedicated staffing to oversee data collection, monitoring. Treasury should conduct a rigorous certification process for opportunity funds to be eligible to act as an investment vehicle, providing a mission test for opportunity funds, not self-certification. And finally, the draft IRS tax form is inadequate to track the program, but Treasury already has the authority it needs through the certification process. Thank you for the time. I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much. Mr. Siebert, over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Kim and Ranking Member Hearn, members of the committee. The Kresge Foundation is a $3.7 billion privately endowed foundation headquartered in Metro Detroit, working nationally. We are focused on creating opportunities for low-income people in America's cities. We raise no outside capital. We provide no for-profit services. We have no stake in opportunity zones whatsoever other than the $22 million of balance sheet protection we have provided to 2 opportunity zone funds that are mission aligned with our organization. Our sole focus in this sector is ensuring that opportunity zones benefit low-income people. In addressing the concerns of the committee, I'd like to suggest that we focus on maybe a different question that's been presented, because I think certainly opportunity zones can address the concerns of the small business economy. The question really should be, will the new marketplace that's been created do that, and what incentives exist for the market to address those concerns? As Brett mentioned, unlike virtually every other federal incentive designed to address inequality, this is not a program, right? This is a private marketplace that is entirely unregulated or virtually unregulated, where private investors deploy capital gains, grow those gains, hopefully in return for invest those gains in opportunity zones, in the hopes of growing those gains long-term and avoiding capital gains in the future. How those gains are invested and who benefits from those investments remains largely undefined. Given that understanding, I think that we should examine the existing capital challenges that face small businesses in this country every day. Particularly for minority-owned firms, many small businesses struggle to access capital because they are undercapitalized to begin with. The lack of equity in small businesses makes it difficult to access traditional debt products needed to grow and expand. Here, opportunity zones could really provide a great benefit. The incentive requires investors to make equity investments in underlying businesses. In a traditional venture capital model where venture investors' return is really enhanced by this incentive, that rationale makes a lot of sense and how the tool is effective in promoting that sort of investment. What's unclear, though, is whether or not the incentive is there to invest in small businesses that don't offer the same growth curve like a tech company provides. Many small businesses don't appreciate capital in that fashion. They're oftentimes illiquid, and it's unclear as to how an investor would exit their investments in a small business if not for a venture-like or private equity-like model. That brings me to my second point, which is really around scale. If you examine the 75, 85-ish sort of publicly declared opportunity funds who have decided to identify themselves as such, the majority of those require a minimum investment of $250,000 of investment, and many are significantly more than that. When you compare that to the data around small businesses, which again, definitionally it's important how you define small businesses, but in the data that we look at, most small businesses are seeking growth equity less than $250,000, certainly, and many under $100,000. I think that mismatch creates a problem for many small businesses where the market is trying to deliver a product of scale, and many small businesses need something that scales down to the business needs on the ground. Third, we want to understand the risk-return in calculus for investors. As been noted, real estate is the predominant asset class right now in the opportunity zone sector because we believe that real estate generally provides a lower risk, an enhanced risk-return calculus for investors. And so while small businesses certainly can absorb capital from opportunity zone investors, the question is, why would an opportunity zone investor, but for the venture capital model, decide to take the risk of a small business when real estate, generally speaking, is acknowledged as being a lower risk, moderate return investment class? And so it's unclear as to why investors would choose to take that additional risk. Knowing the structural issues that sort of face small businesses and the way that opportunity zones overlay, it's really impossible to know whether or not opportunity zones today are going to address the concerns of the small business community. Because of the way the legislation was structured, there's no disclosure or accountability built into this marketplace. The public is likely to never know who raised the capital, where it was invested, and who benefited from that investment. This lack of transparency should be concerning to all of us because as we learned in 08-09, markets without transparency are not only inefficient, but they can also be dangerous. So we truly believe that opportunity zones offer a huge potential to the communities that we are concerned about, but until we have that transparency in the marketplace that is needed, we are going to be very concerned about the impacts on our constituencies and the people that we serve every day. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Great. Thank you for your comments there. Over to Ms. Vasilov. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Sorry, there we go. Opportunity Finance Network OFN is a national network of community development financial institutions, CDFIs. CDFIs are mission-driven community development banks, credit unions, loan funds, and venture capital funds investing in opportunities that benefit low-income, low-wealth, and other under-resourced communities across America. Currently, there are more than 1,000 CDFIs certified by the Department of Treasury's CDFI Fund. Nationwide, the CDFI industry manages over $185 billion in assets. With cumulative net charge-off rates of less than 1%, CDFIs lend prudently and productively in markets often overlooked by conventional financial institutions. CDFIs are the boots-on-the-ground experts in that have been operating in opportunity zones and other disinvested communities for decades. As soon as the opportunity zone provision became law, CDFIs across the nation began reaching out to investors, community residents, and other partners excited about the potential of this new community development tool. Many CDFIs devoted significant resources to exploring how to attract Opportunity Zone investors to the projects with high mission impact that CDFIs specialize in. Regrettably, we have found that the Opportunity Zone tax incentive is not a good match for the kind of neighborhood revitalization deals of interest to CDFIs, particularly those targeting small business. Our member CDFIs tell us that investors expect double-digit returns, prefer real estate to small business investments, and largely shun the more challenging areas that need an infusion of capital the most. As a result, relatively few CDFIs are moving forward with establishing their own opportunity funds. Among those that are, an even smaller number are planning to concentrate on investments into small businesses. The structure of the Opportunity Zone incentive is better suited to investing in a new business choosing to locate in an Opportunity Zone rather than a business already operating in the community. As important as launching a startup venture might be, the health and growth of existing businesses is also critically important, particularly businesses that employ community residents. Two CDFIs that are trying to use the Opportunity Zone incentive for small business investment are Community Reinvestment Fund, headquartered in Minnesota and targeting the upper Midwest for their Opportunity Fund, and AltCap, a CDFI serving the Kansas City market. These experienced small business CDFIs are launching opportunity funds with the goal of investing in operating businesses. OFN strongly supports their efforts and looks forward to highlighting their work. However, both organizations have encountered obstacles and face competition from opportunity funds that are not as mission-driven or as focused on the small business community. Separate from the limited role of the CDFI industry is likely to play, OFN is concerned that community residents, Congress, and other stakeholders will have limited information on how the Opportunity Zone tax incentive has operated due to the anemic data collection currently required by the Internal Revenue Service and U.S. Treasury. OFN has advocated for comprehensive data collection that will show where an Opportunity Zone investment is being made, the results of the investment, and the impact on the targeted community. The modest level of data collection currently planned by Treasury should be significantly expanded to get the full picture of the impact of Opportunity Zone investments. In the absence of an adequate federal data collection protocol, OFN contributed to and strongly supports the Opportunity Zones framework, a voluntary set of guidelines created in partnership with the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance, the Beck Center at Georgetown University, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The framework identifies best practices, a reporting framework, and a shared goal of measuring outcomes. My colleagues, the Kresge Foundation, Urban Institute, and Economic Innovation Group were all contributors to the framework. OFN also supports the bicameral bipartisan legislation that has been introduced to establish reporting requirements for Opportunity Fund investment. In summary, the Opportunity Zone incentive is a poor fit for CDFIs, a missed opportunity to take advantage of the experience, mission commitment, and expertise of this nationwide network of community development finance professionals. Unfortunately, new investments in small businesses incentivized by the Opportunity Zone tax benefit are likely to be disappointing also. OFN encourages members of this committee to support stronger accountability measures in the Opportunity Zone program and to consider other approaches to foster small business development in underinvested communities, including those leveraging the nation's network of community development financial institutions.
Thank you. Why don't we go on to our final witness here, Mr. Lettieri. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, for inviting me to testify. EIG was a leading proponent of the concept behind Opportunity Zones, and I believe it can provide a new lifeline to struggling communities if implemented properly. While there have been a number of previous federal incentive programs aimed at boosting economic activity in underserved areas, Opportunity Zones is a sharp departure from past precedent in its scope, flexibility, and its structure. Perhaps for this reason, it's generated enormous interest from a wide variety of stakeholders. While the incentive was designed to meet a wide variety of needs, its central purpose was to support new businesses and existing small and medium-sized firms in need of growth capital. The topic of this hearing is specifically whether Opportunity Zones can help address concerns in the small business economy, and here I think it's important to distinguish between small businesses and new businesses, because policymakers generally devote too much attention to the former and not nearly enough to the latter. It is specifically new businesses that grow and add employees to which most net new job creation can be attributed each year. It should therefore be of concern that new business formation was abysmal in the wake of the Great Recession, both in terms of the startup rate and the number of new firms created, as well as the geographic distribution of those firms. The latest figures on business startups show no real rebound, making entrepreneurship one of the few indicators that have failed to meaningfully improve. Capital access is especially critical for early-stage businesses, and it is noticeably weak in Opportunity Zone communities. This policy could therefore help fill an important equity financing gap and allow entrepreneurs to stay in their communities to build economic opportunity and wealth for local residents. However, we should be clear that while vitally important for growth-oriented companies, equity capital is not always the right source of financing for local businesses. No one policy can fit all needs. I want to talk about early market activity as we see it around the country. And though it's still early in the life of this marketplace, the Opportunity Zones incentive is already being used to support a wide range of investments across the country, as Congress intended. However, most of the early investment has indeed gone to various types of real estate developments, and that's for a few simple reasons. One of the main factors is that improving the built environment is often a crucial first step in bringing people and businesses back into a community. But a more pernicious factor is the fact that the regulations governing business investment through Opportunity Zones have been slow and unclear. Investments in clean energy, broadband infrastructure, vertical farming, manufacturing, industrial facilities, these are all signs of the long-term potential of this incentive, even if the scale of capital flowing to such investments so far has been limited. Many early investments are going into basic neighborhood amenities, such as grocery stores, medical clinics, and new housing of all different types. Small cities are using Opportunity Zones to build or expand local innovation districts or revitalize blighted downtown corridors. Several early investments are using real estate development to support a stronger startup ecosystem through incubators and co-working spaces. Examples like these will likely proliferate as rules and best practices for Opportunity Zones become more widely understood among communities, investors, and local businesses. However, without additional regulatory clarity and much stronger local implementation efforts, this policy will not reach its full potential. Indeed, regulatory concerns are keeping many investors who would wish to deploy capital into operating businesses on the sidelines. Unresolved technical issues include how to satisfy the requirement that investments in an existing business add substantial new value, timing requirements governing the investment activities of an opportunity fund, how to unwind an opportunity fund and return capital to investors after the 10-year holding period, the ability to recycle capital from one investment to another without interrupting the intended tax benefit. These are fundamental issues that still remain unresolved nearly 2 years into the law's life. So it's no wonder then that the investment scope and scale is limited, particularly for businesses which are less predictable and more complicated than real estate investment. Each of these issues will significantly impact the extent to which this policy lives up to its potential to boost investment in local businesses and create new economic opportunity for residents. In conclusion, in spite of those challenges, I believe Opportunity Zones is a promising new initiative, but it will require substantial new work, additional work, to achieve its intended purpose. Let's be clear-eyed about those challenges. Rulemaking is not yet complete. Community stakeholders lack resources and are still finding their footing. The philanthropic sector, which could be playing a much more meaningful role, has been slow to engage. And investors generally remain hesitant to invest and make long-term commitments in areas where they previously might not have considered investing. That this is hard work should come as no surprise. As a country, we've largely neglected the underlying challenges of disinvestment and decline that this policy was intended to address. There will be no overnight success stories, but with the right tools and a much greater commitment of resources, I believe Opportunity Zones can be an important first step in a new movement of place-based policymaking. Thank you. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, and we appreciate everything that you shared with us, and we'll jump into questions. I'll start by just recognizing myself for a few minutes here, and then we'll quickly move on to some of my colleagues. We're here today, as we said, to talk through some of the imperfections in this system, try to shed light on how we can move forward. Certainly is something that is of high interest in my own district. We have 6 zones in my district, 18,000 residents within those zones. There's a saying in management that you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And one concern that I've had about the Opportunity Zones is the lack of established reporting requirements that don't necessarily provide us with a great measure of success. And we walk a fine line here because we also want to make sure that while ensuring accountability, it's not so much that it suffocates the program or the effort that we're trying to get in. That's something that Ranking Member Hearn and I have both really committed to is really just trying to make sure that we're not overly burdening, especially small businesses and others. But we also are just trying to think through this. So I think for me, what I'd like to ask you is, as we're trying to think through, we'll get to the point about what kind of information you think we would need to know. But I'd like to just start at the more fundamental level of just how would you measure success of this new tax incentive? How would you go about doing this? Is this something that we should look at in terms of job creation or economic growth within these communities, or is there some other measure? I'm kind of first interested in seeing, what would you look at to be able to then come back and tell us, down the road that this has been successful. So if you don't mind, maybe we'll just start with you, sir, and we'll move on down.
So I think in terms of intermediate outcomes and longer term outcomes. And my key intermediate outcome is, where is the OZ capital going? And if the OZ capital goes to the 10% best off zones, if 90% of the capital goes to the 10% best off zones, then we're in a situation where we can already articulate that this incentive is not working well. If what we see is a broad diffusion of capital across all of the zones, and that even the most disinvested zones are benefiting from this incentive, then we're set up in a position to believe that this might be helping in a broader and more meaningful way. We don't have the insights at all to be able to answer those questions. So those are my intermediate. Longer term outcomes are also fairly clear and straightforward. It's about job growth, it's about firm creation, it's about wealth creation for residents in communities that have historically lacked access to wealth.
I don't know if everyone wants to comment on this, but just go down the road if anybody else wants to say anything on this.
I mostly agree with Brett, although I am, we come from the position of what is in the interest of low-income people. And so ultimately for us, when we think about economic inequality, it is really about the economic mobility of low-income people, right, which is really about real wage growth in low-income households. As noted, the lack of transparency makes that virtually impossible, and it's lagging data. It is almost entirely a long-term analysis. I think what I would urge the committee to reject is the false equivalency between the lack of access to capital contributing to the anemic growth in businesses, which is absolutely true. Then therefore, more capital must then cure that anemic growth. I don't think that we can say that. If that were true, if more capital meant more growth, then folks in all of your districts would be screaming for more subprime lending in their communities, right? We moved billions of dollars of subprime lending through low-income communities across this country, and it didn't help, it hurt, right? So it is not about the volume of capital that moves through. It's about the kind of capital that moves into these communities and who it is designed to benefit. So I don't have a short-term answer about how we measure that. I just know what has worked in the past, and we have some examples of more program-like federal programs like the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, the New Markets Credit, federal mortgage insurance, other things that have been designed to help low-income people that over a long period of time have shown some success in encouraging economic mobility. This tool may become the thing that really drives economic growth from a household perspective, from a low-income people perspective, but it is far too difficult to tell, and without the data that has been urged to be collected by the folks testifying today, I don't know that we'll ever get that answer.
Okay. Just in the short time we have, if any last comments for the two of you, and then we can get back to this after we talk to some of the other colleagues.
Just very, very briefly to sort of double down on the need for really any data collection. It's hard to define success or measure success when so little information is being asked of participants in this program. And as Aaron mentioned, there are other examples like the New Markets Tax Credit, where participants in that program are required to provide a lot of information on the transaction level basis. Systems are in place, CDFIs abide by them, as well as other participants in that particular program. I think something comparable could be put in place for opportunity zones.
Okay. Yep.
If I could just briefly, I want to mostly agree with what everyone said and strongly disagree with a couple things. One, I think we all agree on the need for reporting requirements, something that EIG has led the charge on legislatively and in our comment letters to Treasury. So there's no disagreement, I think, on this panel about that. However, I think we're better off looking at this as a policy experiment in light of the large-scale failure of many other programs with a similar intention. and somewhat similar structures to each other to achieve the intended results of stimulating widespread and large-scale economic growth in low-income areas. We don't really know at scale what works, particularly with this new policy. And so you don't just look at the federal incentive, you look at what are communities actually doing. Let's not ignore the fact that states and localities have a vast toolkit of policy and regulatory tools. There are local anchor institutions and partners and philanthropies that can play a part. And we can't judge a place that had none of those assets activated in the same way that we judge a place that had all of those assets activated on behalf of their Opportunity Zone strategy. So we need to look at what places are actually doing to implement locally what is, at its best, a powerful federal tool, but one that doesn't have any kind of mandatory uptake. A community can choose to use it or not. They can choose to have a strategy or not. And if they don't, we should naturally then expect weaker results in those communities.
Okay, great. Well, hopefully we'll get to a second round of questions, but I just want to quickly hand it over to my ranking member to follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's so much to talk about here. I have, as I mentioned, 23 in my district. I live within 5 miles of 19 of those. And being a longtime investor and developer in real estate, small business owner, I'm always looking, like any entrepreneur would be, what's the next opportunity? I do agree where the successes are coming, or where at least, obviously, it's a very short window here we're looking at, but just anecdotally seeing who are investing in these areas, there are large real estate plays. One would have to ask why these areas became blighted, which many of you all in this area, you look at that and you say a lot of this is, there's been people moving out of these areas to where newer neighborhoods are developed, crimes driving a lot of this, changing in traffic patterns, road development, or lack of development, loss of jobs, many, many things. One would argue that to bring these, revitalize these neighborhoods or these particular OZs would be to bring business back in, which is why we're talking about this today. I've always said that most people don't move to a city or to an area because small businesses grow. It's usually a larger business, and small businesses are those who service the employees that work at those larger businesses. So there's a lot to digest in all of this. Again, I've looked at this from, I shared this with our staff. I've looked at this since the moment it was launched, and I've talked to many, many colleagues, including tax attorneys and fellow developers, and it's been very interesting to try to figure out how to make these work personally. But with that said, I'd like to start with you, Mr. Lasheri. Can you just give us any examples of where people have invested in the qualified opportunity funds and how those are being invested in small businesses?
Sure. I think there's a couple examples I'd point to. One is we see some interesting sectors emerging with opportunity zones in use. One of those is vertical farming. So you see there have been a number of vertical farming companies and businesses that have started up either to invest in that sector or as businesses qualified for opportunity fund investment. And so that seems to be a sector that in the early stages, with the limited regulatory clarity that we have, still nevertheless works well with the nature of the incentive. As I mentioned in my testimony, a lot of the businesses that are seeing support from opportunity zones thus far are local amenities like grocery stores and medical clinics and things that we would want to take for granted in any kind of stable community. There's broadband businesses that are standing up to service the connectivity gap in a lot of low-income areas. So there's a lot of creative use cases in the business space that can be used. But I want to, again, underscore opportunity zones as an equity incentive. Many, if not most, businesses don't need or qualify for equity investment. So we need to understand that this is a tool that's going to fit a specific and very important market need, one that creates and can support growth companies that then, as you mentioned, can support a stronger ecosystem of other small businesses and service industries that support those larger employers. What a lot of these communities lack is a real anchor kind of growth company. And what's going to be required to bring them back are some stable and growing employers that can add to the tax base, that can create jobs, et cetera. To Aaron's point, when we think about what benefits low-income people, we know from an emerging body of research that concentrated poverty and economic segregation is one of the very worst things, especially for a child growing up in those types of communities when you look at their long-term life outcomes. When you think about growing up in a concentrated poverty area or a distressed city, services are often lacking, schools, ambulances, fire trucks, police. Those are things that they can't take for granted the way we can in more prosperous areas. So Putting businesses and development in these areas that rebuild the tax base is also an important side benefit to the communities and to the most vulnerable residents because it creates a base of resources that they don't currently have or can't currently rely on.
So, Mr. Lettieri, if I may, just with the remaining time I have here, you know, you did allude to something that none of the other three touched on, and maybe I missed it, but, you know, we try to do this a lot. I've only been in Congress less than a year now, but I've seen it throughout my lifetime. We try to fix a lot of national problems, a lot of local problems with national Band-Aids, if you will. And I realize it's around the tax code that we do that. But it seems to me that the people and the entities that are most equipped to fix these areas are the communities, the cities that most of these areas lie, or the states that they lie in. And it would seem that as we go through and we look at these, that it would be important that we figure out how to include the state and the local governments in these as well, in a fashion that's outside of the private investment as well. Because, again, I look at these, I look at the people who are investing in these areas are very, very, very wealthy individuals. The money knows no politics, and so it's really about return opportunities. And I look forward to listening to the rest of the questions today and us coming out of here with some solutions as we go forward. But I do agree the reporting is just so critical. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great, thank you. Why don't we proceed? I'm going to turn it over to Congresswoman Davids for her questions.
Thank you, Chairman. And I'd just like to first thank the ranking member for acknowledging the loss of our colleague, Mr. Cummings. And I also, this is unintended, but I'm going to, it's like we planned it. I'm going to follow up on the ranking member's question. But first, I want to just kind of talk a little bit about the district that I represent is the 3rd District in Kansas. And Ms. Vasiloff, thank you for, in your testimony, written testimony, and also your testimony in front of us here today, mentioning the good work that AltCap is doing. They recently moved, not moved, but they have included Kansas in their service area. So I have spent quite a bit of time talking to the folks at AltCap, and they're definitely doing a lot of really good work in supporting small business growth in our community. So I know the hope for increased investment in opportunity zones it's definitely exciting and it's promising, and that there are a lot of factors to consider and oversight, especially from what we've heard today, oversight that needs to be done to ensure that the progress from this program or incentive is equitable and that it's sufficient. Kansas, the state of Kansas, has 74 designated opportunity zones, and those are in a lot of different kinds of areas: rural, industrial, urban, suburban. And in the 3rd District alone, we've got 11 opportunity zones. They're in Olathe, in Lenexa, which are both in Johnson County, and then Kansas City, Kansas, which is in Wyandotte County. And each zone and each neighborhood is dealing with its own unique set of challenges, which I'm sure you all are familiar with. Every community has its own unique flavor. We want to do everything we can on this committee to support and promote small business growth and making use of investments in the way that we can. So I'll start with Mr. Theodos. You mentioned community involvement in your testimony, and then the ranking member also started to bring up that concept. I'm curious from you and then everybody else, now that I've used half the time, to talk a little bit about how we can bring communities into the conversation in a more effective way, and what kind of role they need to play and at what stage. Because I think that oftentimes communities will find themselves trying to give input and a lot of decisions have already been made. So if you could talk a little bit about that, it would be appreciated.
There are some fundamental disconnects that make that hard with this incentive. There's not the legal structure or mechanism by which cities or states or counties or resident association or groups can engage to have a say or even to know whether this capital is deployed in their communities. These are private investments that can happen that needn't involve public sector dollars beyond the OZ financing or community residents themselves. So residents may not know this is going on. They may, even if they do know, they may not have any access. Sometimes cities have the ability to control zoning or other elements, but not all places have that opportunity. And so it will be a challenge to think how OZs allow for any real community engagement process in a mandatory, required, or even encouraged way.
You know, you can use this incentive anywhere, and so you sometimes have the inadvertent dynamic of communities almost competing with one another for access to these investors. So in the conversations we've had with some of our members, particularly I think some of the rural opportunity zones maybe don't have some of the other folks engaged that even a Kansas City community does have in place. And so, you know, I suspect that some of those areas are going to be bypassed by investors. You know, we don't know yet.
I will quickly add that when I speak to mayors and governors across the country, I advise them to play a both strong defense and offensive game in regards to opportunity zones. You just start with the needs of your community, understand the capital that is needed, and then form strategies around that, not strategies around opportunity zones alone.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Great, thank you. I'm going to now turn it over to Congressman Stauber. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Hearn, for putting on this discussion today, and also to the witnesses. I appreciate your expertise in the areas and your thoughtful consideration to the questions that we're asking. I've got a few myself. I'll make a comment first. Opportunity zones are a huge deal for northern Minnesota. With over 30 opportunity zones in my district alone, we're making sure rural America knows and that rural America matters. In fact, I have had the constituents ask how can they have their own town designated an opportunity zone since I started here in Congress 10 short months ago. The economic potential from an opportunity zone designation is being felt by our communities. With all good ideas, though, come some challenges. To that end, Mr. Lettieri, what did Congress get right and wrong with the opportunity zones? And then the second question is, what information is still needed to give the opportunity zones the chance to really be successful?
Thanks for the question. With some intellectual humility here, I'll say there's a lot of the answers to that question that we won't know for a while, and this underscores again the need for both patience and data. I think one thing it got right that is, I think, a key differentiator between this policy and other previous programs is the flexibility and scalability of the incentive. Typical tax credit programs cap out at a relatively low dollar amount relative to the national scale of need. So if you have a $3 billion tax credit program aimed at a couple dozen investments in low-income communities around the country, those may be great investments for those individual communities. It offers no promise of scale to be able to meet a wide array of needs in a wide array of places. So the fact that this is non-zero sum, the fact that your district and the communities in your district can benefit at the same time that other places in your state can benefit without it being as zero sum in nature as a scarce tax credit is a huge deal, and I think one of the key features here. The flexibility of use case as well, the fact that you can have multiple reinforcing investments in different sectors in the same community. So housing at the same time you're investing in businesses, at the same time you're investing in infrastructure, that's really important because, as we know, these communities have needs in bunches, not just one specific type of need. And if you get that kind of clustering effect, that's what we know is going to be the most effective in building a durable economy over the long term. I think some of the weaknesses have been already noted, and some of them are also inherent to any specific policy. It's not going to solve on its own really any problem except making capital access easier. It's a tool. It's not a strategy in and of itself. To the Congresswoman's question about what communities can do, one thing that really enhances the market opportunity for communities and gives them more control is doing what they should be doing anyway, which is assessing what are our needs and assets, What is our vision for how we want opportunity zones used? How do we pitch that to the private sector? And about 50 cities have already done that through an opportunity zone prospectus led by an organization called Accelerator for America, which is a group of mayors around the country. That's a great way to assess what are our needs. Let's take stock of our assets. Many of these assets are publicly owned and doing nothing for the community and not presenting any value to investors either. And so activating those latent assets is a huge deal, and opportunity zones gives us the chance to do that.
I appreciate the answer. One of the things that I look at, I too am a small business owner going on 30 years. And so one of the things I look at is the ability to, to access capital. That's tough for many small businesses. But I have to just say from the three other witnesses from this small business owner, I just felt like there was more government layers that you would like to put in place. And from my standpoint, and from what I'm hearing in constituents, is we need rules and regulations. We need to look at the return on the investment, but the additional, I think that's a disincentive. I think that the government is not necessarily the answer all the time. And this public-private partnership, I think, has that ability, but to put the layers upon layers, we're trying to reduce the regulations as much as possible, keeping in line with the return on the investment, and also giving us the opportunity to look and see if it's successful. But what I heard was just from this small business mind, just over and over the regulations and what you're asking these investors to go through. I just felt that maybe we ought to have a little bit more flexibility in allowing the investments to be made by the private partners or private capital to have an influence to hit our small businesses and the communities that need it the most. Like I talked about, the 30 communities in my the district that I represent in Minnesota 8, it's extremely important. So I do appreciate your comments and your expertise. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. We're going to turn it over to Congresswoman Houlihan. Over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the panelists who have come. I represent a community in Pennsylvania just outside of Philadelphia. We have at least 2 opportunity zones in our community, and just by way of data, the median household in Coatesville, which is one of our zones, is $38,000 roughly, but people in poverty is 30%. Median house value there, $115,000. In the city of Reading, which is part of my community, the median household is about $29,000. People in poverty, 36%. Median value of homes are $69,000, and that is in comparison to my whole district, which is about $84,000 in median income, 9.9% in poverty, and the property value of about $300,000. I also come as a businesswoman as well as an entrepreneur, and you all talked a little bit about some really important words. Mr. Theotis, you talked about mission-driven projects. Ms. Vasiloff, you talked about elevating existing businesses. And Mr. Lacheri, you spoke a little bit about the role of philanthropic entities in business. And everyone, including our chair, spoke about measuring what matters, the need to be able to measure success and to be able to know in the long term whether or not this is working. Can you all speak to the degree that you can about your thoughts about vetting standards for the companies themselves? And let me get some specifics about that. Recently, the Business Roundtable CEOs talked about the market signals that are talking about the importance of companies that are thinking about people and planet as well as profit, a shared prosperity, an inclusive economy, the importance of finding companies that are not only thinking about maximizing their shareholder value, but also thinking about the triple bottom line. Is it something that you would consider as being a viable opportunity if we asked of these companies that are coming into these communities, or these companies existing in these communities already, if they held to a certain standard of corporate social responsibility?
I would encourage the use of federal resources to be in advancing community benefit and need. This isn't simply a regulation. This is actually federal spending. And so when we think about what we're getting out of it, we should, in fact, desire to get out of it what we should and want to benefit. And the nice part about how this was initially designed is there's a certification process in place for opportunity funds. And funds could be legitimate gatekeepers if they are certified to pick and invest in mission-driven projects. As currently advanced by Treasury, there is a self-certification process which allows any actor to step through the door in a way that does not steer or any way direct the program or the dollars towards mission-driven projects.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to contribute to that?
I would just say quickly that while I agree that it would be nice for that to exist, we do have a voluntary framework that's been put forward by philanthropy, and there have been we've put forward our own, and the uptake as a percentage of the identified industry is relatively small today. The ranking member mentioned the reasons that these communities are distressed to begin with, and I don't think that we should ignore, or I don't think we should ignore the historical conditions that led to disinvestment in these communities, particularly concentration of poverty, really driven by racism and discrimination in many of these places. And while voluntary frameworks are useful for those actors who want to do the right thing, and we applaud the Business Roundtable for taking that action, right? We know capital doesn't flow to these places, not because these places aren't worth investing, not because there aren't good ideas or smart people or growing businesses, it's because the market doesn't value these places. And this incentive creates an opportunity, right? But without something further to nudge a market in the direction, I fear personally that what we're going to do is reinforce those stereotypes that exist in the way that capital flows currently. And I don't see any mechanism where we sit today to address any of that inequity, particularly racial inequity in a lot of these places. So I am all for voluntary frameworks. Right? We want every good actor to act to their fullest extent, but we believe that it may not be enough.
I agree. I'd be concerned about anything that adds a new hurdle rate to already struggling areas. So things that may sound good in intention, but really come down to an eye of the beholder. So what is a mission-aligned investment? There's a lot of different ways to define that.
Of course.
And creating a national standard for such a wide variety of communities, I think, carries some potential downsides that may have exactly the opposite of the intended effect. And so it's the kind of thing where I'd want to see a lot more state and local agency and engagement in that kind of a process to shape the outcomes.
Don't disagree. I guess my concern is when you are talking about the taxpayer dollar and resources that are benefiting communities, we should have some say in who gets the money, and we should have say in what sort of actors they are. And I do agree that there ought to be, in some ways, a voluntary process there, but also certainly one that incentivizes people to be good stewards to their communities. Thank you, and I'm sorry I run out of time. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Just a few other questions. Why don't we do sort of a quick second round here in case anybody else has some follow-up. I'll keep mine brief, but building off of the first question I asked just about how do we measure the success? The reason I wanted to just ask that was it helps me kind of frame then the question of what information do we need? If the four of you are in agreement to some extent in terms of needing to have some type of information, some type of reporting, I'd like to just try to leave this hearing with a better sense of what all you recommend we need in terms of the scope of that information and from who. Mr. Theodos, you kind of went through, if I remember, the who, what, where, when, and how much. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's three things that I'd like to convey. First, the information needs to be collected not on the tax form, because we need to get the information out. And so we need the information collected not on the tax form. Second, what we need collected is that simple who, what, when, where, how much. Every investor ever has known those details about every investment they've ever made. And so those are not cumbersome reporting requirements. Those are basic inventory tracking. So very straightforward, not cumbersome. And then the third important step is we need this information distributed publicly so that Congress and mayors and governors and others can know, including community residents, how their federal resources are being deployed in their district.
Yeah. Well, using that as just sort of a framework for discussion, what would be the reactions from the three of you? Are you in agreement with that approach of framework? Do you think there needs to be more or less information? That'd be just helpful for me to understand.
I think this is an area where there's a lot of agreement. And in fact, there's a bill in the House that you all have the opportunity to support that would go a long way towards putting some of these things in place that I think all of us are supporting actively.
Okay. Same for the two of you in terms of that framework? Okay. Well, that's helpful from my end. Ranking member?
Statement. I was really pleased with, with the responses that we got from our witnesses today. One of the things, since we are short on information, I would caution us of not trying to kill this program right off the bat here. I mean, there's been some comments made that, became very political in narrative. I mean, I think you said, Mr. Siebert, that the racial and discriminatory, I can think of half of mine that are not in racially discriminated areas. They're where big industry change, moved abroad, left very large vacant buildings out near the airport. Industrial parks has nothing to do with racially discrimination or any of that kind of stuff. So I would challenge us to please keep this on a narrow. I mean, you all have some great ideas. I think you can expect what you inspect, and as the chairman said, it's very difficult to make hard decisions unless you really have some fact-based information. So I would challenge us, Mr. Theos. I think you nailed it perfectly. We have got to get this information. In our state, the lieutenant governor is in charge of managing opportunity zones. I think there needs to be a person that's that has the interest of seeing these communities grow, whether it is the mayors that can roll up locally into the state level. I do agree with you. It needs to be outside the tax process because, again, I can tell you that the largest investor in opportunity zones in our area is a very, very wealthy gentleman from the other side of the aisle that I'm on that wasn't investing in those areas until these opportunity zones came along. So in a free market society, capital will flow where it's incentivized to go and to get the best ROI. And as long as our country is under a free market principles without government interference, that's what we'd always hope it to be. But again, I think we do need to know who's going there, and so that we can adjust, because currently all we're using is our census tract to define these areas, which may or may not be right. Maybe we need to have additional metrics to define how these opportunity zones are laid out and designated. So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No, thank you. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think all of us kind of hit the same points. We all have different qualitative analysis that we're bringing to the table, stories that we've heard or examples, and your insights were incredibly important. I think the ranking member and I are, in agreement that, there needs to be more, and especially on the quantitative side, which I was glad to hear all four of you are in agreement of, and we will think through how best to be able to approach this going forward. We're all aware that the places in this country that need capital investment to bring back jobs and revitalize communities that these are incredibly important, and that we will only have this will only happen if small businesses are given the chance to be able to lead the way. You can look no further than my home state of New Jersey, where small businesses in my district simply need affordable access to capital and simple, fair tax policy that allows them to compete against big corporations. While opportunity zones have the potential to do this, there are still many outstanding questions and concerns that need to be addressed. My hope is that today's hearing allowed us to dive deeper into the subject and how we can improve any place-based policies to improve outcomes in communities that are desperately needed. I just want to take this moment again to just thank the four of you for coming out. I'm sure we'll continue to draw upon your expertise and your insights on this going forward, and look forward to working with you as we try to figure out what's best for our communities, for our small businesses, and some of our most disadvantaged communities in our area. With that, I would ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting material for the record. Without objection, so ordered. And if there is no further business to come before the subcommittee, we are adjourned. Thank you.